Interesting to see this kind of upset from Elon Musk. Now, there was some speculation, as you just heard from Mike Johnson, that he was upset that the subsidies for electric vehicles were taken out of the bill. So I don't know what's behind his upset, other than the fact that Ron Johnson will say it's way too much spending.
Well, thanks for having me on. You know, I agree that there are many ways that the Senate can make this bill better. That's something that the president has said, and I think that's something that a lot, if not most, House Republicans agree with. But think of it this way. What was the past election cycle about? It was about border security, it was about common sense, and it was about the economy. And this bill delivers on that. These are historic, unprecedented investments in border security and deportations, building the wall, building river barriers, providing funding for ICE. This rolls back many of the taxpayer-funded transgender surgeries that so many Americans find distasteful, and it also extends one of the biggest tax cuts in American history. That, I think, is a win. Of course, we can make this better, but this is a great bill.
So how would you make it better? Because Senator Ron Johnson is talking about $22 trillion in 10-year deficits. That's $2.2 trillion a year. He's talking about the CBO numbers, which take debt, overall debt, from the current $37 trillion to $59 trillion in debt by 2035. He says this needs to be much lower in cost and needs to see many, many more aggressive spending cuts. So you've seen the bill. You voted for the bill in the House. How would you make it better?
You know, I think that there's two things that we can do. We can roll back more of the Green New Deal than we did in this bill. And two, we can not provide so much leeway for the SALT cap increase. I think those are two big things that we can work on that the Senate can get done. But listen, this bill, think about this bill in a 10-year window. That's the budget horizon. We've got about $4 trillion in tax cuts. That's offset by $1.6 trillion in mandatory spending reform, the biggest mandatory spending reform in American history. And then you've got another $2.5 trillion or so in economic growth, which, by the way, the CBO doesn't give us full credit for because they don't take into account the economic stimulation of tax cuts. Absolutely. So this is a bill that, over the 10-year budget window, actually decreases net deficits. Again, I'd like to decrease that faster. There's more work we can do, but this is a fiscally responsible bill. So,
I mean, fiscally responsible bill, I mean, the Committee for a Responsible Budget says it's going to add to the deficit by about $3 trillion. If you were to roll back the green subsidies, as you just said, and you were to roll back SALT, which, I don't know, you've got to thread this needle because you've got lots of members who claim that they delivered the majority for you from blue states and they need that SALT deduction in there. So I don't know about that. But if you were to roll back those two things, what kind of savings are you talking about? Because if you're going to get back to pre-COVID spending, you're talking about, you know, cutting what, $4 trillion? $3 trillion?
Well, listen, there are hundreds.
To get back to pre-COVID
There are hundreds
spending?
of billions of dollars in additional Green New Deal spending we can roll back. There are also hundreds of billions on the SALT that we gave. But remember, this bill, reconciliation, only looks at mandatory spending. It does not look at discretionary spending. It cannot, by law, look at discretionary spending. So we are limited into what we can do in this big, beautiful bill.
And I think you make a really good point about growth, because that's true. The estimate in terms of this, scenario is growth of like 1.6%. But today we've got the Atlanta Federal Reserve saying that growth is going to be 4.6% in the second quarter. And you've got Kevin Hassett out there saying that, at the White House saying that growth is going to be 4%. However, the OECD just cut growth numbers for the whole global economy, and they're talking about growth closer to 1.6% for 2025. So it depends on where you sit on this. Mehek, you want to weigh in here?
I do. I would love your perspective, Congressman, on what tariffs will do, because that's something that you really don't see a lot of individuals talking about. I know the budget office isn't weighing in here, but President Trump has really reset trade policy, and that means there's going to be an injection in our economy. How do you see the trade policy playing here for the economy and the American people?
Well, that's an excellent point. And remember, none of these projections on spending reductions or on tax revenue take into account tariffs whenever we're thinking of reconciliation. A 10% tariff across the board is scored by the CBO at over $2 trillion over 10 years. That's not a part of any of these calculations.
Yeah, that's good.
Going back to your question on growth, what we underwrote on the budget committee, which I sit on, is a 2.6% average 10-year GDP growth rate. The CBO only gave us credit for 1.8%, and many economists are saying that 2.6% is actually very conservative, and I think that we're going to find that to be the case. So there's a lot of upside here on things outside of the specific reconciliation that are very positive for the debt and the deficit over a 10-year window, and I think that we have to look at the big picture here of all of the things that President Trump is doing for the economy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And on tariffs, you've already seen tariffs bring in $22.5 billion just for the month of April.
Yep.
And if you extrapolate that into a year, you're talking about $750 billion. You're talking about 10 years in terms of tariff revenue. So it must be factored in. I agree with that. What about this rescission package? President Trump sent an official rescission request to lawmakers yesterday. This is the first package that would codify $9.4 billion in DOGE cuts. It includes cuts to the U.S. Agency for International Development, as well as cuts to NPR and PBS. Why aren't you taking this up for a vote until next week, Congressman?
Listen, I think we should be taking this up for a vote this week. This is something we've been talking about that the American people have been begging us to do. You know, defunding NPR and PBS has been a priority for conservatives for decades. I'm thankful that we finally have a president who is actually willing to do it and that is actually sending us a rescission bill. I don't think that we can defund these agencies fast enough, so I agree with you. But the timeline that we have right now is to take this up on Monday. I suspect there's going to be a whipping operation to make sure we can get this across the finish line, but we're going to do it. Republicans are sick of funding funding propaganda outlets that are bashing Republicans and running cover for Democrats or for funding left-wing pet projects all over the globe.
All right, Congressman, we'll be watching your work. Thanks so much. We so appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Congressman Brand.